All right, can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. Well, first off, let me welcome everybody to, and thank you for inviting me back. This is a good night to do a Zoom program with the rain that's falling outside. So let's see if I remember how to do all this. I just did a quick practice. All right. So the wonderful world of waterfowl. This is the short version because as I was designing this little program, it became hours and hours long. So we're not going to see all the birds, all the waterfowl, but we will see a lot of them. And I'll try to keep it within a reasonable time as we go through this. So waterfowl, what is waterfowl? Waterfowl, as according to the dictionary, says that it is ducks, geese, and other large aquatic birds, especially when regulated as game. And waterfowl is one of the species that is a huntable species. And a lot of the ones that we'll be talking about tonight are species that you might see hunters out in the next few months using it out there, gathering their resources and harvesting their sports and things like that. And a lot of hunters and the comment of hunters get a bad name, but majority of the hunters and the conservation efforts and the management efforts from hunters and the money that's derived from hunting licenses is the key component in managing a lot of these conservation efforts and programs to maintain and sustainability of these populations. So it is a rather important thing. Hunting is going down in the United States. It's not as popular as it was, and we're starting to see if we can find alternative resources to help maintain these populations. So waterfowl. Waterfowl migrate from their breeding grounds down to their wintering grounds, which right now here on Long Island is the wintering grounds for most of the waterfowl that are coming in North America. We have 4 major Atlantic flyways or major waterfowl flyways, and these are relatively designed around state borders. They were first constructed or established in 1948. They were designed by what was then later called the Flyway Councils, which was created back in 1952. And these councils help with the individual state organizations and biologists, as well as federal biologists, help to maintain and design these flyways that will help us to monitor their populations moving back and forth between their breeding grounds and their wintering grounds. And this in turn will help us to monitor those populations to maintain somewhat of a sustainability, determining on the population changes as well as habitat changes for these birds in their different zones, whether it be breeding or wintering grounds. We'll talk about some of that as we go through the program. So we obviously are in the Atlantic Flyway, which is densely concentrated along the east coast of the United States. The bulk of the wintering birds that are going to be migrating from the Nova Scotia, from the Hudson Bay area up in Canada, around the Arctic Circle, will be migrating towards the shorelines. As temperatures begin to cool, all the freshwater access will decrease and freeze over, and those birds will take shelter along the coastline where the water will stay open, allowing them to feed. The Mississippi flyline is an abundant area filled with rivers and streams and lakes, and they too will be migrating southward towards the Gulf Coast out of their breeding ranges as well, taking advantage of the resources of the Gulf. The Central Flyway, which is considered the duck factory from the prairie potholes and all the freshwater ponds and lakes during that area where their primary breeding grounds are, as well, migrating down there. And most of these designed pretty much with the state lines. Now, and then the Pacific Flyway, which is on the West Coast, all the way from Alaska straight down into parts of Mexico through California. But we know birds don't follow highways. They don't follow concrete ways. So a lot of these areas get overlapped. And that's what makes fall migration so mysterious and wonderful, because we really don't know. We know majority of what's going to be showing up along the coastlines and what bird species we're going to be looking for and what we anticipate to see and what makes us excited to find those creatures along those shorelines. But we do have possibilities of birds that are not normally along the Atlantic, kind of jutting over, moving over from the other flyways, because they do overlap immensely. There's not one highway that each one follows, depending which way the weather's blowing, which way the active currents or weather patterns or warm fronts and cold fronts, you're going to get shifts in movements of these birds as they migrate south out of their breeding grounds. And that's also determined by different types of weather conditions, as well as environmental factors. We notice a lot of the forest fires out west. That'll play a role in some of the migrations occurring in the Central Flyway and the Pacific Flyway, either moving them or altering into different areas. Flooding in the lower Mississippi areas will also have a role in that migration movement. So weather patterns, environmental disasters, droughts, floods, things like that will play a role in that migration, as well as food supply. Many of these birds are migrating south because they're losing their food supply. It's either getting too cold, the water is freezing over, they can't find their fish or aquatic food, aquatic plants, so they're going to migrate south where the water is more open. So here's a nice illustration here of some of the migration patterns, especially along the Atlantic flyway, and how crazy some of the out west species may, depending on the weather, depending on the air currents, may hit the coastline, the East Coast, and where they jump between the islands in the Caribbean as they go down to Central and South America. On the right, I have found this nice little table. Doesn't have all the ducks in it, but it gives you a good majority of what the last breeding population survey was that occurred at the beginning of this year. So each year, federal government, in conjunction with those flyway sections, asked their states to monitor bird populations, especially duck populations. Those duck populations are usually occur during the week of Columbus, Martin Luther King week is when that data is collected. So all the winter migrants from all different areas, and it's tabulated up, and that information is then in turn figured out the population changes, what is changing, and this also helps those flyways and those biologists and those agencies to devise hunting regulations, what can be shot, what can't be shot, do we limit this, do we stop hunting on that type of species, all based on these management practices, these readings and these surveys that we take. So we can see from some of the more common species in the last few years, they don't have 2020 and 2021 because of COVID, the numbers didn't really line up the way they wanted to. So they kind of yanked those out a little bit because of the amount of participants was extra low. But we did participate in a lot of those surveys anyway. But we can see the overall changes from this year, from 2019, which is the last full non-COVID surveys that were tested, compared to this current January, or this past January. The numbers are up for a lot of species. Ringneck duck is down, but most species as of 2019 to now have been up. Overall, though, in the long-term aspect, most of these species are dropping, and it's not for the reasons that you think. It's not overhunting. It's not too many people shooting ducks. It's actually loss of habitat mainly due to sea level rise along the coasts. Those birds that need that food supply during the winter migrations are losing access to areas where they can feed. And also different regional areas in Canada and Nova Scotia, in those areas where there's still logging practices and things like that. Habitat up there is dropping a little bit. And we're trying to put into place some conservation efforts to kind of promote those habitats, those breeding grounds to be maintained as best we can. And put this in just today, just to keep you guys aware that here on Long Island, If you start to hear shotgun shells out in the bay when you're out there birding looking for these ducks, it will start next week. So this week you'll have the veterans and military access limited to them, which this week, and I did not hear anything. So usually you don't hear too much during those months. But beginning the 19th, you'll start to see or hear the shotguns out in the bay. And just looking at this year's count, we can see that the scarp numbers are down. So we can see that their bag limit has been reduced severely, 2 birds daily, which is, we'll see that in our in the presentation later on why that is. Canada geese, different season, different reasons. Canada geese is a population problem in some areas in the United States, especially here in New York. So it's monitored a little more in depth than some of the other duck species because of the fact that it has other consequences in terms of population in different areas. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the Flyway Councils, they work together in collaboration to develop these frameworks to design what days will maximize the different seasons. So it's not just a random number that's placed out there to make people happy. It's designed to sustain those populations as best they can for the time that those birds are here during their winter migration, during their time here in New York. So that's why some of the dates line up with other areas, but some of them are a little off. And they're off because of that fine tuning to kind of control and maintain some of those populations. Populations that are too high or populations that are too low. So here's where I am, the Marine Nature Study area, coastal community. Now let's see if this works. You tell me if you see another map. Do you see another map? Is it getting bigger and smaller? You can just wave. So here on the south shore of Long Island and most of Long Island, we have our coastal communities on the north shore and on the south shore. And on this map, we have a kind of panned out with some of the different pond areas. So you're going to see a lot of your duck species are going to be in and around before the frost. So before these freshwater ponds begin to freeze, this is where you're going to see most of your duck species in those freshwater ponds. You'll see them only in the coast, in the channels, along the Marine Nature Study area, at Jones Beach, depending on the species. But most of your freshwater duck species will be in the freshwater areas, unless it begins to freeze. And once these areas begin to freeze, maybe in late January and February, you'll have periods where there could be ice on these little ponds. That's when you'll see them being pushed down to the shoreline and take up residence, finding food along the coastlines. So we have a lot of good pond areas: Lost Pond, Silver Lake, Hempstead Lake, Cayman's Pond, Massapequa Park, Massapequa Preserve. All these good freshwater ponds. We got a few in Rockville Center and Wantor, Twin Lakes Preserve. So there's a lot of places on Long Island that has these little ponds in different spots, which are good spots to find nice close-up observations of some freshwater duck species. All right. And this is the #1 question people ask me all the time. Why do the ducks' feet don't freeze? If I stick my fingers in the water, they're going to get cold and they're going to start hurting and they're going to go numb. The ducks, waterfowl, and most animal species, even us humans, we have a method of what we call counter current heat exchange. And that's the proximity of your blood vessels, of your arteries to your veins in certain parts of your body. And this works in both ways. We actually adapted this technology, if you would say, this natural world technology, in terms of our thermal heat generation. When we put pipes down into the ground to have geothermal heating systems, we're pumping water down. It's being warmed or cooled by the earth and then being pumped back up to the surface. So you're constantly maintaining a temperature gradient through that pumping of water underground. Same thing occurs in birds and in humans and in mammals. Certain species will have certain adaptations to allow them to live in areas of extreme temperatures. Ducks, in one case, have that counter current in their legs, so when they're standing in that cold water, their feet get nice and cold, but the arteries are pushing warm blood from their down-filled feathered bodies, keeping them nice and warm, down through their legs. And as that warm blood goes into their feet and legs, the temperature of their feet warm up. And then the colder temperature, once it gets cool, goes back up through the veins and it in contact again with the warm blooded from the arteries that are coming down. Warms that cold blood up through the leg before it goes back into the main body. So maintaining a somewhat consistent temperature in their feet, even though they're standing in cold water, even though there's ice on the surface. And if you stood barefoot on ice, it's gonna hurt. You're gonna get frostbite. But the ducks, with this countercurrent heat exchange, allows them to keep those feet from freezing solid. And if you think about it, it works in both directions. If you think of, say, a flamingo, you look at a flamingo with their long neck and their funny beak and their extremely long legs. Why a bird with extremely long legs rarely goes in deep water? And the reason is flamingos feed on brine shrimp. They feed on invertebrates that are in extremely warm waters, sometimes almost close to boiling in terms of heat wise. And it's in very shallow waters. And their feet are in that hot water. So they have very long legs to allow the hot water that's boiling or warming their feet to go up the length of their legs, and it works in reverse. So the warm blood from their feet is going up through the length of their legs to be cooled down before it goes back into their bodies. So it's a form of heat regulation in reverse. So they're cooling their bodies, even though they got long legs, but they don't go in deep water. They're using the length of their legs to cool the blood before it goes back into their body. So maintaining that temperature control. So now we're going to go into some of the different duck species and how to identify them. And when doing duck identification, first you want to know the duck hunting habitat. So where is it going to be feeding? Where is it going to be finding its food? What's its food supply? Is it plants? Is it animals? Is it invertebrates? Is it fish? We're going to look at body size because body size is good. And we're going to use our age-old mallard to give us that random body size. Is it bigger or smaller than a mallard? Duck flying habits. Does it fly fast, quick? Is it kind of a lazy flyer? Does it go slow or fast? Duck sounds. We're gonna tap on that just very little. And then duck colors, because the colors, especially for the adult male ducks, are very easy, very identifiable for you to figure out what they are. Female ducks, a little different. But the male ducks, a lot of them have very distinct color patterns on them. So it should be pretty easy to help identify them. And here's some of those male duck species, with your ringneck and your canvasback and your mergansers and your ruddy ducks and your bufflehead. A lot of nice bold colors and a lot of nice patterns on these birds and very distinct changes in some of these birds. Lesser scarp and greater scarp kind of look the same. They have slight differences with them, but for the most part, a lot of these birds are visually different, at least in the male aspect of the species. Then we go and we look at the female ducks, and they're all brown. So when we look at the female ducks, we're going to have to use a little more of our detective work in trying to figure out from a distance or through binoculars or through a scope what these duck species are. If there's not a male hanging around, or sometimes in the summertime when they go through a molt, the males go into what we call eclipse plumage, where they kind of look very similar to the female. So it gets a little harder. But for the most part, they do have similar patterns. So your mallards and your godwalls, your blue-winged teal, your pintails, your widgeon, your shovelers and your green-winged teals all have somewhat of a uniqueness to them to help us figure out what they are. Because again, remember that these birds, the female birds, are sitting on those nests. So their coloration is going to be designed to hide their bodies as they're sitting on those necks. The males with their flamboyant coloration, they're the big target. So they're the ones, if a predator is going to go to that nest, it's their job to distract the predator with their flashy colors and move them away from that nest site so it does not disturb their eggs or the female. This is a good book or a good pamphlet that's produced by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service a long time ago. And I'm going to use this as an intro to each species to give us just the basic understandings.
Okay. That's pretty good.
Here's a good size comparison of some of the different species that
No, you
we'll
can
be
say
talking
when
about.
hunting season is, so you might use in place.
So we have our trumpeter swans
Next few weeks.
being the biggest, and we go all the way down the list to our smallest, which is our green-winged teal down at the bottom. Here's our mallard,
Oh.
kind of halfway through it, giving us our size difference. And for some reason, they have pintail above mallard, but in actuality, other than the fact that the pintail has a very long tail, pintail is actually a little bit smaller than the mallard. So that's a misprint there, but maybe not. All right, we'll start off with the big elephant in the room, the Canada goose. Canada goose were species that migrate from Canada to the southern regions here in New York. Originally, back in the 30s and 40s, New York State decided that, you know, Canada goose could be a food source. So let's start breeding Canada geese in New York to maintain a sustainable population. And that kind of backfired on us a little bit, because now we have resident Canada geese that live in New York year round, but we still have the Canadian Canada geese that continue to migrate back and forth between the different areas. So you definitely see more Canada geese in the wintertime than you do in the summertime. Canada geese are plant eaters, so they're going to be feeding in open fields. Their entire body is designed to be on land, walking around, grazing on grass and vegetation. They're going to be flying in those Vs that we see overhead, honking and making themselves known, finding areas where they can feed on vegetation. Here on Long Island, there's a lot of parks. There's a lot of ball fields. There's a lot of high school football fields where these Canada geese show up feeding all that food that's out there. And you have different sizes of Canada geese. And just recently, the Canada geese used to be greater, lesser, and cackling as subspecies. And now that cackling is now a separate species. The cackling, you can see his beak is a little bit shorter, and it's almost as small, and the overall size of the bird is much smaller as his smaller cousin, which we call the brant. And the brant is what makes the South Shore, the wetlands, the South Shore, very popular, because these birds are coming from the Hudson Bay area in Canada, coming down to the shoreline, feeding on the seaweed and marine algae that's out there. They breed, they graze on the plants all on the shoreline, whether it be salt marsh cordgrass, whether it be the ulva, which is the sea lettuce that you see, the big leafy stuff you see floating out there in the bay. Their primary original food source here along the coastline was eelgrass, which is a food source for a lot of the vegetarian birds that come to the coastline. Our eelgrass population is not as abundant as it used to be due to water quality issues and things like that along the shoreline, as well as habitat loss. But the brant continued to feed on a lot of the other vegetation, especially now the sea lettuce, the big leafy green seaweed that you see along the shoreline. When they migrate south out of their breeding grounds, they migrate in small pair family groups. And you can easily spot the family groups with the somewhat larger, because they're bulkier, of the adult birds. Solid black, they have the little white crescent or little chevrons on the neck, compared to the ones that were born this year, which are the birds kind of in front of this guy right here with their barred back and the chevron really not as pronounced as the adult birds. And they'll stay in that family group for a while until they finish their wintering grounds. And when breeding season begins back in June of next year, they'll fly back north and begin the process all over again. Brant nesting areas in the north region are surveyed by the North American Breeding Bird Survey. And the populations right now are uncertain. They're very highly monitored and surveyed. In fact, this coming week, we have a local Brant survey here that we'll be participating in to see how much of the adult and how much of the juvenile birds migrated down from the south, so we can gauge how successful they were in their breeding for this past year. Their populations is heavily monitored by not just the states, but also because it's a federal protected bird. It's monitored by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And these surveys monitor that population and they gauge whether or not the growth rate increases or decreases. The main issue with Brant right now in terms of population control and the fluctuation of their breeding habits is in their breeding grounds. So areas up north where you may have oil drilling or wetland dependent species losing in terms of water quality in their ranges, things like that. You also have ground predators, which could be snowy owls, could be red fox, could be Arctic fox, that are feeding on the eggs as well. So their populations are in flux, but somewhat stable. During migration, they winter in along both coasts, so not just on the east coast, but also on the west coast, depending on where their main breeding population was. Remember, those fly zones are not concrete. Those fly zones, depending on which way they flow, it depends on which side of the country that they'll fly down to. And we also see different color variants. A lot of people want to say, oh, well, you know, it could be a hybrid with some other species, maybe a barnacle goose or maybe a Canada goose or things like that. And that does happen, but it happens very rarely. Most of the color changes that we see in Brant or Canada geese as well, or even some mallards or any bird species, is this an abnormality in the reduction of pigment in that bird, which we call lunistic. It's the absence of certain colorations in their genetic makeup, giving them these little white spots or these white deterrents on their bodies. And I know this is not a hybrid species, because when he opened his wings up, he has an entire wing that's white. So hybrid species would not have such range of variance in that. So he's missing a whole section of his color gene in one of his traits, giving off that very odd wing coloration. They fly down pretty much in the middle to the end of October from their breeding grounds. They're primary coastal birds, so they'll be feeding on the seaweed and the coastal marsh grasses. You might see them up in fields. They've been slowly following their bigger cousin, Canada geese. If there's feeding in somebody's park or ball field and they see Canada geese there, they will land as well with the Canada geese feeding on that grass in those parks. Many of the challenges for these birds is loss of habitat as a result of climate change. As sea level rises, their food supply gets less, especially along the coast. Those marsh grasses kind of change over to different species that are not one of the ones that they prefer. So as the coastal sea level rises increase and our marshes get smaller and smaller, their wintering grounds, their food supply for the winter will also get a little smaller. So that's why we're monitoring them pretty closely to see what they're feeding on, what are they eating, are they adapting to a new food supply, especially here along the East Coast. Our next bird is snow geese. Snow geese with a nice white coloration, another plant eater. So they feed on vegetation, grazing on grass, grazing on aquatic vegetation. That eelgrass and some of the sea lettuce now that they're switching over to is part of their primary food source. You might see them mixed in flocks. If you go to Jamaica Bay, you see big flocks of them. If you go down south to Maryland and Delaware regions, you'll see huge flocks of snow geese along those shorelines feeding and taking benefit from the Chesapeake Bay salt marshes as well. Watching these huge flocks of snow geese swirl over in crazy little patterns and honking and the very loud black and white geese up in the sky. Among them, you might see some dark ones or ones with different colorations mixed in. And they're not a separate species, but a different color variation, which we call the dark morph or the blue goose. So it's still the same snow goose, just a different variation in color that mixes in with that population or with that family group. They kind of mingle with Canada geese. If they see Canada geese feeding along the shoreline, they'll kind of drop in and see what they're feeding on, take advantage of the Canada geese, helping them to find different food supplies. Again, we can see one of those Canada geese with that lunistic quality there, little white specks in its neck. So again, not a hybrid, just a genetic conformity. Snow geese hunting in the United States stopped in 1916 because the population dropped extremely low. And then it was after the population regained from conservation efforts, monitoring those habitats, helping preserve and create more habitat, it was reopened in 1975 after the recovery of that population. So now the population is somewhat stable, mainly from their tundra habitat and their breeding grounds. You can see an immature bird on the left-hand side with the darker coloration. And I threw a mute swan just because we have a white bird. Canada, we have the snow goose. And when some people might see a swan passing by, they might get excited, think it's a snow goose. This exotic mute swan, an elegant bird, also very aggressive. And mute swans, even though they look beautiful and they look wonderful, they're not that great for our native wetland species. If a mute swan takes over a spot, it'll pretty much prevent any of our native species that are nesting in that area from living in those unique spots as well. They're very aggressive, very territorial around their nest sites. They also, in some areas, pose hazards to humans. There's instances in Central Park where mute swans killed people's dogs that were walking their dogs. Here on Long Island, we don't see too much of that, but we do see incidences where mute swans, unwary kayakers, paddling past, and all of a sudden a mute swan comes out of nowhere and knocks them off the kayak because the kayaker did not see that there was a nest along the shoreline. So they are very aggressive. They're a big bird, and they are a non-native species. They feed mainly on aquatic vegetation, removing some of the grasses or even feeding on maybe 8 pounds of material a day. So they eat a lot of food. So that food for a very large bird, feeding on a lot of food, reduces that food supply for many of our native species. And when they're flying, as many of you might have seen or heard, those wings when they're low, sounds like a wind-up toy. The whining back and forth as those massive wings beat very slowly as it flies through the air. Mute swans form very strong and lasting bonds, and since they do not natively live here in the Americas, they do not have a migration pattern. So wherever you find mute swans, that's where they stay. They become resident birds of that location. And we've noticed that mute swans are starting to adapt very comfortably to human and urbanized areas, especially areas that are being overtaken by another non-native species, which is in the background of this picture, which is giant reed or Phragmites. That area or that type of reed material is big enough and sturdy enough for these mute swans to pack down and create a nice nest for themselves. And since it's a plant species that's not too beneficial to a lot of the native species in terms of food supply, the mute swans take to it rather easily. That black knob on the males will swell up during breeding season, get really big. And after breeding season, it kind of shrivels back down. So they really can't tell male and female apart because the size of that little rubbery knob is about the same when they're not in breeding pattern. So it only swells up during the breeding. Now we'll go into our puddle ducks, our dabblers. So these are our mallards, our teal, and our shovelers and things like that. Birds that are ducks that feed mainly on vegetation or plants, and they feed close to the surface. So they're feeding on that surface food, whether it be seeds floating on the surface, grain, aquatic insects, invertebrates. So our first bird of the dabbling ducks is our mallard. And mallard is about 14 inches, 24 inches long, give or take 2.5 pounds, a little more. With that iconic green head, that gray body, those yellow beaks, probably the most common duck you're going to see. Originally a Midwestern species, so a bird that, or a duck species that was primarily in those prairie puddles, those potholes out west. And as humans started to migrate from the East Coast out west, cutting down trees and opening up areas, allowing the mallards to move to the coastline. So mallards here on the East Coast is not normally supposed to be seen here, but they made their way to the coastline. What makes the mallards easy to identify, other than the fact that they have a green head, is that they have this here where the sun's hitting, it's purple, but it's usually a nice royal blue patch on their wings that is bordered by these white lines. And those white lines are going to play an important role later on in helping us determine any hybrid possibilities between other species. Because that white line is a positive indicator. They feed mainly on vegetation at the surface. You might see their butts bouncing up and down along the edges as they pull out aquatic vegetation from the base. The females, again, that blue patch on their wings, bordered by those white lines, tells me this is a mallard and not a black duck. You can consider a mallard as a tan duck with dark highlights. So it's mainly a tan duck, and if you look at the wing feathers and the feathers on its body, it has dark edges, dark highlights in the feathers. And when we compare it later on to a black duck, you'll see the reverse in the effects. So the overall appearance of the female mallard is tan with dark highlights in it. Flocks of these birds usually early in the morning or late afternoon. If it's in if you're in upstate New York or near a cornfield or a farm field, they're usually out in the fields, taking advantage of the excess crop that was left over after a harvest. These are your normal ducks that you will quack. There's not too many ducks that actually quack, but mallards are one of the ducks that will make that quacking sound that you normally hear so often. Mallards are also primarily monogamous to a point. They'll mate with the same female or mate over and over again, but once that female has been mated, the male has the option to go and find another one, but he will always come to his original to protect and monitor that nest. So if he happens to be out while he's feeding or doing something away from the nest and there is an available female, he may go over and do something to share his genes in the population. But again, this is a good example of that mallard female with that coloration hiding in the dense grass compared to its male counterpart, which stands out nice out in the open. So female matches the background. So when she's sitting on the nest, she's invisible to predators. The male, the big, bold, obvious colors to attract that predator away from that female. Here we have some of those hybrids. Mallards are the ancestors of nearly all the domestic duck species, except for Muscovies. Muscovies, they look like ducks crossbred with turkeys because they got the big red skin patches all over their face. But your Peking duck, your Long Island duck, all the different farm duck species originated from breeding different traits out of these mallards to get your different types of variations. Here we have a hybrid. So this is most likely a hybrid between a black duck and a mallard. Mainly the mallard genes was the dominant, at least in this instance, but you still see some pattern forming at the base of the beak, kind of bleed through. Also the white that would be here, the bright white or gray pattern on its sides or belly is kind of tanned out, darkened due to that crossbreed or that hybridization. Here we have some domestic ducks. Again, members of that same family, that mallard family, but bred out to certain characteristics. Then we go into our next species, which would be our native East Coast salt marsh black ducks. Same size, same patterns in terms of shape and body structure as your mallards from the West. These were the mallards of the East, living in the salt marshes here along the East Coast. Now we look at this duck. This duck is a dark duck in terms of dark brown with light highlights on the outside. So it's an overall dark duck, solid brown, with maybe some light highlights on the edges. Often very shy, regarded as one of the wariest ducks in terms of can't really sneak up, except here on Long Island, where in some of the main freshwater ponds, especially in Milburn Pond over by the Coral House, you can see a lot of these black ducks gathering in those local areas. Very swift, very frequently found along the salt marshes. They prefer to be in protected bodies of water in the salt marsh or in ponds, sometimes mixed, especially here on Long Island, mixed with other species of ducks, mallards and pintails and things like that, redheads, different spots. Their color pattern is very similar to the mallard, remember, but again, see that white, that blue pattern on the wing is not outlined by white. So this is a pure black duck, pure American black duck. If this was a hybrid black duck, you would see the solid brown coloration of the bird, just like other black duck, but your blue scapula or this blue patch on the wing would be outlined in white, similar to your mallards. That would denote a hybrid. Right now, when we do our duck surveys, there is an actual line in the survey list that says to determine whether how many of the black ducks are hybrids and how many of them are actually true native black duck. Right now, in terms of population of black duck, it's not only the loss of habitat, but it's also the interbreeding between the species that is kind of messing with the overall population of these birds. The mallard that was mainly a central U.S. species mingling with the East Coast version is kind of muddying the lines a little bit. And we see that a lot here on Long Island because of the quantity of mallards versus black ducks. American black ducks, mostly plant matter, maybe some insects during the breeding season, but mainly they're plant eaters, feeding on seeds, roots, tubers, stems, leaves, plants growing on the surface of the water, plants growing under the water. They are your traditional dabblers. Usually very social, staying in groups in the wintertime. When they're flying and if you don't get a good view of the blue on the wing compared to a mallard, remember a mallard's belly is white. So it's kind of a grayish white other than being, if it's not a female. And if you see a group of black ducks flying by, all you see is the bodies in the bottom of the wings. The bodies are solid brown with the big white patch on the underneath of the wings. So they're very easy to spot when they're flying. Also, if you get a good view in your binoculars as they're flying, you notice the tail is flat. It's a flat edge to this tail. And your mallards will have that little curlicue, that little pigtail that curls up on the back. So black duck, black in terms of where they live. Remember, these are marsh birds. Remember, the color of the mud in the marsh is dark. So whether you're a male or a female doesn't really matter. You're going to be camouflaged in that environment. The males, black ducks, are usually darker than the female. So they have a more solid dark brown color with less highlights, whereas the females have a little more of those highlights to blend in with the grasses that they're moving through. Since black ducks are coastal nesters, they got very much affected by the DDT that was used. And a lot of the pesticides and the pollutants that are in the coastal waters that are trapped in the salt marsh soil. Remember, salt marshes are filtration systems for the mainland. They filter out and clean the water. Any of the organisms that are living in the salt marsh and feeding on the vegetation in the salt marsh may in fact over time ingest some of those pollutants, whether it be mercury or DDT or pesticides that are in that soil, in those vegetation. They'll get that in their system. Green-winged teal, much smaller bird than a mallard. Remember, mallards were 24 inches. This is only 15 inches. One of the water dabblers feeding on the surface, straining out seeds and invertebrates by dipping their beaks into the water, maybe sifting through some of the mud in the mud flats, taking out some of the invertebrates there, but mainly dependent on plant material. They love feeding on plants. Again, another freshwater species, and will also move into saltwater areas if the water begins to freeze. In the back, you see a female mallard. Gives you a good size representation. That mallard is further away from these teal, and you can see the size difference is drastic. Remember, that mallard is 24 inches. These teals are only 15 inches. Green-winged teal eat mainly aquatic invertebrates and seeds, feeding in the shallows. If you go out upstate New York or further out west, you'll see them sometimes in the fields or in the freshwater lakes and ponds out there. Flying overhead could be a little tough to identify them because they're very similar to their cousin, the blue-winged teal, in terms of their flight patterns and their coloration under the wings a little bit. But they make a whistling noise. They should be able to at least know that they're teal and not a mallard or any of the other species. Green-winged teal are closely spaced combs, or I won't call them serrations, but more grooves in their beaks that allow them to sift out material, the invertebrates that are in the water. Most of your dabbler ducks, even your Canada geese and your mute swans, will have those comb or those grooves in their beak to help sift that material out. Good time to see the green-winged teals is usually in the early spring, and they're usually the late fall migrants. Here's a female green-winged teal. All right, so you have your green-winged teal flying through the air, and you have one that doesn't look like the other, which is the guy in the middle. And if you notice, all these green-winged teal have the green coloration on the back of their wings with no other pattern. And then you have this guy right in the front, and he has a big noticeable white patch on what would be his wrist of his wing right there. He's somewhat of a different beak, not too much of a different beak, but you can see the under part of the wing is almost the same. Not quite, but almost. And that is your blue-winged teal. Blue-winged teal, it's a little bit bigger than the green-winged teal by an inch. They overlap a little bit depending on where you measure them. But the adults, males, are very different in appearance with that nice big crescent along the eye or the beak, their speckled body and their dark tail pretty much makes them stand out very easily. And right behind them is your female. And your female looks like any other brown female duck. So if you're not looking very carefully at some of the patterns or lucky enough to have a male nearby, you might get confused if you do not have another bird in for a size comparison. So if you have nothing to gauge size, that may look like just another mallard type bird sitting over there. These birds are long distant migrants. They move or tend to move between North and South America. So their migration ranges a lot in terms of some of the other species we saw. Blue-winged teals feed mainly as dabblers, dipping their beaks in the water, submerging their entire head in the water. Sometimes you see their butts up, but just mostly their heads and necks are under the surface of the water, feeding on some of the deeper vegetation if they have to. Blue-winged teal is the second most abundant duck in North America. Their populations have remained stable since the mid-1960s until even now. So their population has not gone up, has not gone down. They are, for some reason, a very stable population. Their habitat, their breeding habitat, and their wintering grounds, maintaining that population very good. Their small size, when they're flying through the air, they twist it a lot. They do a lot of aerodynamic, acrobatic maneuvers. So if you've seen them flying through the air and you see a duck doing that, it's not going to be a mallard. It's not going to be a black duck. It's going to be one of the smaller species, the teals, probably doing that activity. They're usually the first ducks to migrate in the springtime. So you'll see a lot of blue-winged teal in the spring. And I think this picture was from the spring because I see some of the grasses starting to turn green. So this was probably May, late May, because the brant is still around. And we go into our widgeon. Again, this bird is a little bit bigger than the teal, 21 inches. Remember our mallard, 24 inches, so still smaller than a mallard, but bigger than a teal. The female mallard right here, a female American widgeon. Chestnut coloration, but it has that two-tone kind of light blue beak on it, allowing it to be identified from its species. Mostly plant eaters, feeding on some aquatic plants. Also eats some insects and snails on occasion, but it's mainly a plant eater. The adult male, formerly known as the ball pate, because it kind of looks like a bald spot on the top of his head, with that chestnut kind of coloration on his body, the little green wave on the back of the head, and again that dark bud, just like the teal have. They're versatile foragers, so they can feed on pretty much anything as long as they're in shallow waters. They sometimes will submerge underwater to get some of the aquatic vegetation, but mainly not. But what they do to take advantage of that submerged vegetation that they don't want to go underwater and get, they will hang around birds that do. Coots, redheads, ringneck ducks, ducks that are diving under the water to get that vegetation. And when those ducks and coots come up to the surface, widgeon have a tendency to steal the food out of the beaks of those birds. So they take advantage of the other duck species that are utilizing that resource that they can't get to on a regular basis. Again, male and female, male on your right, female on the left. They're relatively noisy ducks when they're around in groups. They have that little, much shorter beak than many of the other duck species, more like a goose beak or a short goose beak, because they're feeding, remember, they're nibbling on the surface plant material. So they're pulling vegetation off the surface. Over the past few years of monitoring this species in terms of its habitat and its migration patterns, this bird, believe it or not, is declining in population. Not by a lot, but it is declining. And the fluctuations are unknown. So we have some ideas why, but there's too many possibilities. And there's not one factor that seems to be the cause of their decline. Droughts out west in the prairie potholes, if there's not enough water, if the populations drop, seasons where there's a lot of water out there, the populations increase. So it's changes in agriculture, changes in habitat. So there's not one thing that we can say, oh, this is the cause of the decline or the cause of thing. It's just a lot of variations that we're still trying to figure out which is the primary cause. And we go from our widgeon into our pintails. Pintails, 26 inches. And that's 26 inches because when you measure a duck, that long neck comes into effect. So you measure duck species or bird species from their cloaca, from their hoop chute to the edge of their nose. That's where you get your distance. Pintails have one of the longest necks in the duck world, other than geese. So it gives them the extra length, makes them a little bit longer than a mallard. But when they're sitting in the water, they look smaller than the mallards. Pintail males, nice chestnut head, dark patterns on their bodies. And again, the female, very drab, nondiscrete, so it can blend into its habitat when it's nesting. There's zigzaggy flyers. These are birds that are on all of the flyways. So they're not just dedicated to the East Coast or Mississippi or the Central or the Pacific. They are found in all the flyways because of where their breeding zones are. Mostly seed eaters, sometimes insects, but the main diet is plants. So again, dabbling at the surface, feeding on grains and weeds and vegetation grown at the surface. Female pintail, again, you can see that pink or that light blue color in the beak, just like the male has, the same kind of shape. So that same pattern will help you distinguish if you make it not a teal. It's not a blue wing or a green wing teal. It is a pintail. You can see the size comparison when it's with mallards. So again, the illusion that the fact that it's longer than a mallard is because it has a longer neck, not because it's an overall bigger bird. You can see compared to the mallards, it is a small bird. Foraging in the shallows, it sometimes will dip its entire body over. You'll see just the duck butt hanging out on the surface with its long tail wagging on the surface of the water, as it just gets long enough with that long neck to get some of the aquatic vegetation at the bottom of the bays and the ponds. And now we know why these ducks can stand on that ice, right? Counter current heat exchange. You got a nice pintail with some black ducks. Again, remember, black ducks almost the same size as mallards. You can see when they're kind of sized up together, the pintail overall without its head or neck extended is smaller than those black ducks or those mallards. And we have a group of teal, and one of them is a pintail. And if you can guess in your head, the pintail is the one in the middle. So bigger than all the other birds, not by a lot, but noticeable. Pintails usually migrate at night. They're night migrators, and they can travel between 48 and 50 miles per hour. So they're long distance night migrators. Seemingly at home on land or in water, northern pintails usually like if they're in freshwater environments, open fields, feeding on grains, and usually erupt into flight from straight surface to air. So they don't need a running start. They just pop up right from the ground. Again, because of the fact that they're relatively a smaller bird species. Northern pintails are roughly common in most of the flyways. Their populations are also declining. And this is mainly because, remember, since they utilize all the fly lanes, and a lot of their habitat is in agricultural areas. So their breeding grounds or their nest sites are not necessarily destroyed via predators, but they're actually destroyed by accident in agricultural areas, fields, wheat fields, corn fields, things like that. So there's efforts to help to identify and create areas that are set aside on private farmlands or commercial farmlands where the birds can continue to breed in a relatively safe environment. And we have our godwall, 21 inches, about the same size, a little bit smaller than a mallard. Another nondescript little duck. Godwalls are the most numerous in the central fly lane. So coming down through the central US, the prairie pothole areas. Foraging mainly for on the surface for vegetation, so seeds, grass material, some aquatic vegetation, sometimes invertebrates. The color pattern of the adult, that black tail area, that black butt, solid gray coloration. And again, your female godwall with that same nice camouflage brown coloration. Mostly feeding on plants. Compared to most dabblers, it eats a lot of leaves and stems other than just seeds and grasses. So you might see the godwall feeding on fallen leaves from trees in the fall, some of the stems along the edges, some of the things you would think are not food supply this bird eats. This is one of his favorite foods. Small and compact, has fast wing beats when it takes off. Again, remember, because it's a little smaller than the mallards. This bird's population has increased since 1980. So in conservation efforts and adjacent wetlands and restoration projects, this bird has been one of the most successful species in regaining its population. We move down to wood ducks, probably one of the most colorful of the duck species. Just go back there, 18 inches, 18 inches. So wood ducks abundant in the North American population during the time of Audubon. So one of the most abundant duck species. And during the wood duck population seriously declined during that same period because of the fact that it was so abundant. It was almost brought to extinction due to that fact. Not just because it looked pretty, but it also apparently tasted good. Since it's a cavity nester, it's one of the few duck species that are cavity nesters, and there's more than you think. But living in the margins around lakes, fallen trees, necessary for it to lay its eggs inside a tree cavity. That's why you see a lot of wood duck boxes, man-made wood duck boxes in areas to kind of promote the species to breed in those specific areas. Male wood duck, very flamboyant in its coloration, almost looks fake in terms of its color. Female wood duck still has some of the flamboyantness, but not as much. The gray tan, remember, it's a cavity nester, so it's inside a structure. So it really doesn't need to be completely camouflaged in its environment because it's inside a structure taking shelter. Forages in water and on land, so it can feed on submerged vegetation as well as the grasses and vegetations on the surface. You might see it walking around. One of its wonderful food sources is acorns. It loves to feed on acorns. So if you have an oak tree near a body of water, you might find a good supply of wood ducks in that area, taking advantage of those acorns. Female wood ducks, also known as egg dumpers. They are one of the duck species that do interspecific brood parasitism. So yes, a female wood duck, if it finds another nest and happens to look in it, will lay a couple of its own eggs in that nest. Whether it be a wood duck, whether it be a hooded merganser, this bird will lay its eggs in some other nests to kind of maintain its population. Wood ducks have been found throughout the year in most areas, depending, because remember, because it's a cavity nester, so it's not specific to a specific zone or different area. As long as there's a cavity near a body of water, it can reproduce and maintain a population. Shovelers, 19 inches. So again, smaller than the mallard of 24. Shovelers with that very unique beak, that spoon-like bill, takes the whole aspect of filtering out plants and invertebrates to the next level. Perfectly designed to be the dabbler of dabblers, feeding all that microscopic plant life and vegetation on the surface. Similar color patterns as some of the teals. So you have the blue patch on the wing, the green bar in the back of the wing, the white body. Perhaps one of the most awkward because of that spoon-shaped bill, feeding in the shallow wetlands. They don't regularly forage on land because of that specialized bill. So you can see the mallards in the background feeding on the surface in this lawn, this grassy area. The shoveler is not going to be doing that. He's probably up there because something scared him out of the water and he's going to mosey back into the water. So they're reluctant to come onto the land unless there's something spooks them. But they're going to be more in that water. They're going to be filtering out the organisms and the plant material that's in the water with that very specialized bill. Its unique shaped bill has comb-like projectiles, just like the other dabblers, but just more of them. It's highly specialized in what it does. Northern shovelers, like most of these waterfowl, monogamous, so they're gonna stay together with very long pair bonds. They go back and forth from their wintering and summer grounds as a pair, staying together for most of their fall migration. Northern shovelers are common for most of the flyways, and their populations have been stable. So we have seen no noticeable increase or decline of the shoveler population as a whole for North America. We're going to move into diving ducks. And diving ducks are designed specifically to chase things under the water and or grab vegetation from deep under the surface of the water. So their entire body structure is very different. Their legs are positioned to the back of their bodies. Just like your boat has an engine on the back, a submarine has a propeller to the back. It's all designed to move through the dense water more efficiently. So they have different adaptations. Diving ducks you are not going to see on land on a regular basis, if at all. Only if they're sitting on a nest or building their nest will you see them on land, because it's physically uncomfortable for these birds to be on land. Think about it. Their legs are at the back of their bodies. If they do come up on land, their whole body structure is going to be upright, almost not as severe as a penguin, but somewhat at a 45-degree angle because of the positioning of their body with their legs. So when you see diving ducks, they're definitely going to be in the water all the time. In those ponds and along the shorelines, Jones Beach, Jamaica Bay, they're going to be in those coastal areas. First one we'll start with is canvasback. Canvasback, 22 inches, again, smaller than your mallard. Canvasbacks, normally in the world of ducks, she kind of takes take a cue from those wood ducks. Remember, the female wood ducks will lay her eggs in multiple nests. Oh, canvasback females also does that a little bit. The term, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Well, I think they made it for canvasbacks. Canvasbacks not only make their own nests and lay their eggs, but if they happen to find maybe a redhead's nest or a golden eye's nest or any nests that are in the same area where they are, we'll lay a couple of eggs in each one of those nests as well. So they're not too specific just for themselves. So they'll go lay their eggs. The female will go out to feed while the male incubates them for a little while, give her time to get off the nest. And that during that time period, as she's around doing her thing, feeding around, if she stumbles upon another nest, she will go over there and if ready, lay an egg or a couple of eggs in that nest too. Canvasbacks with that wonderful bright white back, giving them the fact that it looks like a canvas. A painter's canvas, that dark chestnut head, that dark red eyeball, and that noticeable silhouette of that beak, that slanty silhouette of the beak, pretty much identifies it with no other duck species. Canvasbacks are unique just by their silhouette, if you didn't see any of the color at all, but that unique beak structure. To get airborne, remember, because these are diving ducks, all designed to go under the surface of the water efficiently, they're usually heavier. They have denser bones than the mallards or the teal. So for them to take off from the surface of the water, they get a running start. So if you see a duck on the surface of the water and he's walking on water trying to get off the ground, he's most likely one of the members of the diving duck groups. Feeding behavior is slightly variable in some areas depending on the time of the day. These kind of ducks will feed on invertebrates and fish during the surface of the day. Some veg and maybe vegetation in the evening when it's a little darker. Canvasbacks fluctuation in their population as well. So some years you have high populations, some years you have low populations. So it's not necessarily stable, it's not necessarily increasing, and it's not necessarily decreasing. But the numbers of populations overall as a species has increased since the 1950s. So the population overall in North America has increased, but it fluctuates, it cycles, depending on the available food supply, depending on the locations of where they are, which flyway, which region of the US that they're in. They're very dependent, remember, on aquatic vegetation and material. If the water quality is not the highest quality, they lose food supply. If the food supply is low, their populations will drop. If next year the water quality is better, there's more food, the population increases. So their fluctuation in population is based on their availability of food in those regional locations. Scorp. And scorp are one of those species that when you're doing your bird counts and you're on eBird, or you just want to just say it's scorp. You don't want to say it's greater. You don't want to say it's lesser. Just make it scorp because I'm not sure which one it is. Well, hopefully we're going to figure out or help you figure out which ones they actually are. So scorp, you have greater and lesser scorp. Greater scorp normally are going to be in your open water, saltwater locations. So coastal bays, along the inlets, out in the major large bodies of water. Lesser scorp will be in the canals. They might actually sometimes be so up in the canals, they might enter some of the freshwater ponds. So they're also a slightly smaller. So you can see the size limit for greater scorp is 18 inches, whereas the lesser is 17. So you have a little bit of overlapping there in that location. So you have the lesser scorp on top, which will have the purplish head. Greater scorps will have a green head. I've seen both swap the colors depending on which way the sun hits it, just like a mallard's head. Sometimes it's blue, sometimes it's green. You will see some of that color swap depending on which way the sun is hitting it. But on the most part, graders will have a green head, lessers will have a purple head. When they're flying by, you have a second option to see whether or not they are lesser or greater scorp. Lesser scorp will have a white band on their secondaries and then fade to a gray or a tan color as they go into their primaries. So just having that dark white band at the base. The greater scorp will continue that white line all the way into the primaries. So if they're flying by and you're not getting a great look at them and you're able to snap a quick picture of them, maybe in one of your pictures, you'll be able to see that change or that color change in those spots. The males and females of this group, which include the scorp and the ones that kind of look like scorp. We have your greater scorp here in 1A and 1B. Lesser scorp, 2A, 2B. We have our ringnecks that you'll see in the freshwater areas. So you see at Hempstead Lake, you see them at Cayman's Pond, you see them at Smith Pond. Areas like that, you'll find the ringnecks. And again, very similar to the scorps in coloration. Slight difference in the beak. Now they call them ringneck ducks because, and you can't really see it too well in this picture, but their neck has a chestnut ring, so it separates them. And you have the tufted duck, which is kind of rare here along the East Coast. But again, very similar in patterns. Even the females have very similar shapes and patterns to them for these scorp species. Lesser scorp primarily feed on aquatic invertebrates such as mollusks, insects, and crustaceans, but also eat some aquatic plants and seeds when that resource is unavailable. They're primarily going for those invertebrates, chasing them under the surface of the water. You can see them in comparison to the brant that are here, much smaller than the brant. They form tight-knit groups, the lesser scorp, so they'll stay in little tight groups up in the canals, up in the channels, large rivers and reservoirs sometimes, but they're mainly would be considered the freshwater scorp kind of species. Lesser scorp is one of the most abundant of the diving ducks in North America because of the fact that they can live and survive in the brackish water as well as the freshwater. Lesser scorp are common throughout their range, but numbers depending on the region, we have slight declines in different regions since 1966. So we're watching and we saw this year when we looked at earlier the hunting regulations for scope for this year, the limit has been severely altered. You only can have 2 per day. Or in the past, it was larger quantities. That's because, remember, the Flyway Council, in conjunction with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the different state agencies, change those regulations on a regular basis based on the surveys done at the beginning of each year. So it's never the same. It's always changing to maintain the sustainability of those resources, of those populations in those regions. Here's a good description of 3 different scorp species mixed together. So we have our greater scorp on the far right. In the foreground, the 3 birds in front of us are our lesser scorp. And then shooting up there in the back is your redhead, all roughly around the same size with different characteristics. The diversity is very similar to the great scorp in terms of compared to the lesser scorp. They're very social birds, so they'll hang out with multiple species. So you'll see them mixed in with greater scorp, with redheads, with maybe canvasback if they're in the area. Here's a group of ringneck ducks. And then we got our greater scorp. A little different. More white, goes all the way into the primaries. Their beak is a little broader, more like a mallard beak compared to the teal-like beaks of the lesser scorp. Big, chunky beak on them. Out in the bay, remember the open, deeper waters is where you'll find the greater scorp. So he's a nice group. The sun's hitting it just right, so you can see that green head are visible in some of the areas. This guy happens to have his wings nice and open, so you can see the white that trails from the secondaries into the primaries all the way across. Great. So if a comment through all the ranges and their populations are somewhat rapidly declining. And that's mainly because of where they primarily are. They're coastal bird species. Again, remember, all your coastal diving bird species that are in salt marshes, in wetlands, are affected by all the pollutants that could be in those Pacific wetlands. Here in the Northeast, and we see it in our salt marsh sparrows, there is mercury in the salt marshes here in the Northeast. And that mercury travels through the food web into the plants. The plants are fed on the insects get fed on by the sparrows, and you get mercury buildup, bioaccumulation in those organisms. The same things are happening in the duck species as well. The invertebrates that they're feeding on are growing up in the marsh mud. Marsh mud is filled with the mercury. So over time, as they feed on more and more of those organisms, the mercury builds up in their system and eventually poisons them. So we're seeing that effect not just in the salt marsh sparrows, but also in some of the duck species as well. And we have the greater scorp flying away, and our next bird species right in the foreground is the bufflehead. Bufflehead, another little diving duck, 14 inches long. Stragglers during the migration. In fact, we were just had a conversation about bufflehead this afternoon. If anybody spotted any along my area and out in Middle Bay, and I have not seen bufflehead yet, but they're usually the last to migrate in big flocks, feeding on primarily fish areas. So they're the last holdouts in their northern ranges, feeding on the fish. As long as the water's open up there, they're going to continue to feed on that fish that's up north. Once those lakes and those ponds freeze over, then they get pushed south. And this weekend could be the weekend where we see some of those buffleheads start to hit the coastline. Because we're supposed to have some pretty cold temperatures the next couple of weeks up north and maybe possible snow flurries. Largest concentration of the bufflehead is in the seacoast and in the Gulf of Mexico. You have a few inland areas where if the water is not frozen, you'll find them in those areas. But for the fall and the winter migration, they're mainly in the coastline where that food supply, which is their primary fish food supply, is more consistent. Females will be completely black and immature males as well, with that little white cheek patch showing. And the big brightly colored males with the big white patch on the back of the head and that iridescent black, green, purple, depending on which way the sun is hitting it, coloration on the face. Very small in size. Unlike most divers, they can fly straight up from the water. So remember, I told you most diving ducks are heavier, denser boned, so they need a running start to get going. These birds are small enough that if they have to, they can shoot up right from the surface of the water. Most of the times they don't, because whatever they're being spooked by is coming from a different direction, and they can use less energy by running along the surface to get a head start. But if they're trapped or an aerial predator is coming down on them, they can shoot up right from the surface of the water with no problem. Buffleheads dive for aquatic invertebrates, mainly crustaceans and mollusks. So they feed on the mud snails and the rib mussels here along the shoreline and some of the smaller clam species. Typically, they swallow their food while they're underwater, so they don't bring the food up to the surface. Think about it. Maybe it's an adaptation they learned over time. So as maybe predators were stealing the fish or food from their mouths, so they decided to swallow and eat the food under the surface of the water. And they can stay underwater for a rather long time, usually between 12 to 25 seconds, typically under the surface of the water. So when that bufflehead goes under and you got your binoculars on him and he goes underwater, he can pop up a very good distance away from where you last saw him. Usually silent, but they do make some squeaky, grunty noises if they get agitated. Bufflehead populations have steadily increased over time, so their populations have been doing well. They're of low conservation concern because of their populations being not only stabilized, but also increasing. So whatever they're doing, whatever they're feeding on, maybe not relying so much on the coastal resources like the other diving ducks because they stay longer in their freshwater area, taking advantage of the food supply up there before coming to the coastline. Long-tail ducks, 20 inches long. Again, smaller than your mallards, even though they got those long tails, but we don't take that into account when we measure. Long-tailed ducks are able to swim very deep. They're one of the deepest swimmers of the diving ducks, reaching depths of almost 200 feet to forage, whether it be on crustaceans or invertebrates under the surface of the water. So they can go pretty far down. The coloration is kind of unusual because their patterns and their molt timings are kind of different from other bird species. Other birds will molt and go into their eclipse coloration for a short period of time during the breeding season or right after the breeding season. So as they have nests, they will start to molt because now they have to hang around the nest site with the youngsters. They don't really need their flight feathers, so they have the opportunity to molt to get new flight feathers. And it lasts maybe a few weeks at the most. These birds, when they molt, they actually change to a whole different plumage, and they're there for a long period of time. So long-tailed ducks, usually the molting patterns are kind of different. Technically, the birds in the wintertime that we see, those birds, that is their breeding colors through the winter. In the spring, they molt to these kind of colors, which is kind of opposite or reversed of what they were. And they wear that through all of the summer. So not just a few weeks, until they get their new feathers. They look like this the entire summer. And then will molt into their breeding plumage again in the wintertime. And we have the ruddy duck, very tiny diving duck, 15 inches. Ruddy ducks are compact, thick-necked, almost kind of characterized of a duck in terms of the beak and the head and the body. The ruddy duck often dives or swims away from danger rather than flying away. So if there's something chasing it or moving around towards it, these ducks more likely will go underwater and swim far, far away from the predator or the disturbance rather than trying to take off. In the wintertime, most of them are silent. They don't make too much of a noise, just hanging out, floating, usually in Mill River over by Lester Pond and Rockville Center. Might see a nice grouping over there. Some of the more tidally influenced creeks or canals. They're also rather social, so they'll mingle with some of the scorp in those same canals, the lesser scorp mixing in with the ruddy ducks. Both adults will feed mainly on aquatic insects and crustaceans and zooplankton. They might get some seed if they have to, but it's not their primary food supply. They're feeding more on animals. And they will go dive to the bottom of the shallow ponds or canals, sifting their beaks through the mud looking for those invertebrates. And again, they will sift through that mud and feed at the bottom, not usually bringing their food to the surface. They have that noticeable stiff tail. Ruddy ducks spend most of their vast time in the water. Again, remember, the diving ducks, their legs positioned to the back, so you're not going to see them on land that often. They're early fall migrants. The ruddy duck populations have been stable, so they're one of these good duck species where the populations are roughly stable. So that hasn't changed too much. But again, remember, these ducks are coastal duck species. So they're also influenced by the mercury and the pollutions that are in the coastline. So we're watching them very carefully. That nice stiff tail pretty much separates them from any of the East Coast duck species. So these guys are usually pretty easy to spot. Golden eyes. You have your Barrow's golden eye and you have your common golden eye, and denoted by just very nondescript kind of patterns on the face. So your Barrow's golden eye will have this more of a teardrop length on it, whereas the common golden eye will have more of a spot between the eye and the beak. Females somewhat look the same. They have a kind of chestnut head to them. Sometimes the Barrow's golden eye may have maybe a yellow tip to its beak, but most of the time they look the same. Common golden eyes are primarily feed on mainly aquatic invertebrates, fish and fish eggs, with some vegetation and some seeds, but not their primary diet. They feed mainly on the shorelines in the shallow waters. Common golden eyes will eat crustaceans, mollusks, crabs, shrimps, barnacles, mussels, things like that, with that very odd looking beak that they have. Common golden eyes breed in boreal forests, so in freshwater regions. So in the wintertime, it's best to see them here in North America when they're close to the shoreline, because they're in areas in their breeding grounds where normally we wouldn't see them on a regular basis. Most golden eyes winter in protected coastal areas and still fairly visible in most areas, North Shore and South Shore. Their populations have been pretty much stable as well. This is another bird species. We talked about wood ducks being cavity nesters and hooded mergansers, cavity nesters. Golden eyes are also cavity nesters. Harlequin duck. You see those down at Point Lookout along the jetties. Get their name from their unique coloration, the navy blue, the white patterns, the chestnut coloration. These birds in their breeding habitat live in raging rivers. So very forceful, very white water rapid type river systems is their normal breeding grounds, feeding on crustaceans in those areas. So these birds, when x-rays are taken, usually have a lot of broken bones that have healed over time because of the fact that they're in very rough waters trying to maneuver through those areas. Harlequin ducks mostly feed on invertebrates and small fish. And in there, here along the coastline, maybe they'll add some crustaceans and invertebrates as well, mollusks. You see them a lot along the jetties, probably grabbing barnacles and crustaceans off the rocky jetties along Jones Inlet, Point Lookout, and Long Beach jetties. Females, remember, kind of look like scoters. So if you're out there along Jones Beach or the coastline, you're looking, you might maybe confuse a female with a scoter, but usually they're very different in terms of beak structure. Wintering populations here in North America are much smaller than historical records. So they have been on a decline. It's not clear why. Remember, these birds breed in whitewater rapid type river areas. So along places up in the upper north. Some suggest that maybe areas that are being logged get a lot of sediment in the rivers and streams, clouding the water, adding turbidity to the water or sediment. And it kind of makes it harder for them to find their food source. In their wintering grounds, they're also highly susceptible to oil spills. So areas along the coast where there could be oil runoff or an oil spill also will play a role in for them finding food, since they're diving in along the shoreline where the oil that's floating on the surface washes up against the jetties and in the rocks, kind of right in their spot where they're looking for their food. And again, same reason why all the other coastal birds in their wintering range are affected, which is that mercury and the bioaccumulation that occurs during the time that they're here feeding along the coast. All right, we're coming to the end. Bear with me, we're almost there. Red-breasted mergansers. 23 inches, so almost the size of a mallard, a little bit smaller. Males with their flamboyant mohawk type head, flaring about. Red breasts is denoted because of the red breast coloration on the front of their bodies. Females, again, will have that same kind of scraggly hair, mohawk type area, very thin beaks. But the females will have that brown, pale chestnut color to them. Mergansers are also known as sawbills because they have serrated beaks, and that serration is not to chew their food, but it's actually to hold on to the fish that they're grabbing on. So all that fish, that slippery fish that they're feeding on, those serrations over time, over evolutionary change, allow them to feed and hold on to those fish with a better chance of not losing it or slipping out of their beaks. The wintering grounds here along the coast, along the shoreline, taking advantage of all the fish that are out in the bay. Here in the salt marsh, all the fish, all the killifish and the bunker and the small fish that enter the salt marsh during the summertime will now spend most of their time out in the middle of the bay where the temperature is more consistent. They don't want to be in an area where the temperature rises and falls on a regular basis, so they'll stay in the deep waters of the bay, and that's where these mergansers take full advantage of their adaptations, chasing those fish under the surface of the water. You can see him right lined up with the mallard. Remember, only a couple of inches shorter than the mallard. But beak structure, adaptations, completely different than the dabblers, even some from most of the diving ducks. This is a very Pacific fish-eating duck species. They tend to use salt water compared to which would probably be the next species, which is the common merganser. So you'll find them mainly in the bay systems. Their primary food is fish, and they dive underwater with types of birds have what we call nictitating membranes that go over the eyes, allowing them to see under the water to chase those fish down. They actually have seen behavior where groups of these red-breasted mergansers will herd schools of fish to an area and help to get a higher count in terms of catching those fish, or a higher ratio of catches of food supply. So they'll work together herding those fish. Red-breasted mergansers are one of the fastest of the flying ducks. They've been clocked between 75 to 80 miles an hour in a flat flight. So they're very quick flying ducks. Notice the legs positioned again because they're diving ducks all the way to the back of the body, sometimes even stretching out past their tail. Their legs are not underneath their body, like the mallards and the geese and the dabblers. Their legs are positioned all the way to the back of their bodies. Red-breasted merganser populations are roughly stable, so there's no increase or decrease. So whatever they're doing different than the other ones is not affecting their population statistically. Common mergansers much bigger than your red-breasted mergansers by a few inches. It's even a little bigger than the mallard. Remember, a mallard was 24 inches. These are 25 to 25.5 inches. You mainly see these in the freshwater ponds. So here locally, Hempstead Lake is usually a great spot to look for common mergansers. Smith Pond, which is across the street from Peninsula Boulevard, another great spot. See common mergansers. When those areas freeze over is the only time where I will see them out in the bay. So he's a female common merganser out in the bay, taking advantage of the shorelines. And here's another group out off the end of the nature study. This occurred during that period where we had most of those ponds and lakes freeze over. So they have to go to the next available food supply. And we have our hooded mergansers, which is a small merganser, the second smallest of the mergansers in the world. Smallest is the smew, which is a European merganser, which if you go to the Bronx Zoo or some of the local zoos, you'll see smews in the bird collections. Hooded mergansers have a hood, so they're very easy to distinguish from the other mergansers very easily. They're black and white pattern, they're chestnut underneath the side. Again, remember, they need a head start to get off the water, so they're running on the surface of the water. They feed mainly on crustaceans and fish. Remember, that serrated beak specializes them for that specific food supply. So they're at the top of their food chain. That hood or flag on the top of their head, very noticeable. Hooded mergansers, just like the goldeneye, just like the wood duck, are cavity nesters. So they nest inside tree cavities in their breeding grounds. Hooded merganser populations are fairly common in all of the flyways, and their populations have increased over time. So since 1966 to 2019, their populations have increased North America wide overall by one of the biggest percentages. I think it's between 6 to 7% increase in population. So their population has increased dramatically. We don't know why. And that is the end. So I took a lot of your time, but I hope you learned a little bit about some of the stuff here, and it would help you in your search in the next couple of months looking for these birds along the coastline in our local ponds local areas around the different spots. So now I'll open up the questions, and I see there's some questions in the chat already. So let me close this. And we'll start to see some of the questions.